I told someone that we were going to call this the Northern Camp of the H.W. Brands Fan Club. Mr. Brands has been here at least 3 different times that I can think of. That's how much we adore him and his books. He is a prolific biographer. I would encourage you to read any of his books. I can honestly say I've not read them all, but I think I've only missed 2. You spoke for Mr. Reagan's biography and for an FDR book, we know. And I don't know if there was another one or not, but he hails from Texas, folks. So he traveled quite a ways, and he escaped from the professorial classroom for 1 week to do this book tour.
Just so for you.
We are delighted to have H.W. Brands here. And in case you miss him when he's not in Hudson, I have it on firm authority that you get to be seen on the History Channel pretty frequently, too. And C-SPAN. And PBS, yeah, that's true. So without further ado, because you don't want to hear me, I'm going to talk to Mr. Brands and hand him the microphone up there and let him discuss with you. Thank you for welcoming him, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Gwen. Is this on? Can you hear me in the back? Okay, well, thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you all for having me back. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm delighted to be back. It's always nice to speak before an appreciative audience. I teach at the University of Texas, and this semester I have 2 large classes. And one is a class of 500, mostly freshmen. And it's a required course in American history. And I like to think that I make it interesting for them, but there is that compulsion factor. That if they didn't have to be there, and I take attendance, I'm old school that way, I take attendance, and if I didn't, they wouldn't all be there. Now, I'm not taking attendance on any of you. You don't have to be here. So I'm actually very honored and flattered that you took time out of your evening to come. So thank you for that. I'm going to tell you about this book that I wrote. It's called America First, and the subtitle is Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. So this is the first America First, the one that originated in the late 1930s, early 1940s, in opposition to American intervention, American entry into World War II. Now, the term was resurrected in the 2010s by the Donald Trump campaign in 2015 and 2016. And I have always wondered, I don't know how much history Donald Trump himself knows. So I'm not sure if he understood the historical ramifications. I'm sure that people in his campaign did. But anyway, but it's interesting. But that part's interesting. And I will confess that using that as the title was partly to draw connections between then and now. For the following reason, that I'm going to sort of lay out for you, this is not the central part of the book, but it is the central reason that I wrote the book. So when Donald Trump was president, for the first time since World War II, an American president directly challenged the underlying premise of American foreign policy ever since World War II. That is that the United States needs to develop and maintain strong alliances, that the United States needs to take the lead among the democracies of the world. The United States needs to be the dominant force for peace and democracy and those kind of values in the world. And this had been something that every president from Franklin Roosevelt up until Barack Obama just made as a matter of course. And Donald Trump, for the first time, challenged that view. And his challenge resonated with a lot of Americans. And, he got elected. But it's interesting that the mere questioning, that the challenge to this, I'll call it the Roosevelt consensus, got the kind of reaction in other circles, the ones who weren't in favor of this questioning, that had been the reflexive reaction ever since Roosevelt, and that is, the first term that was thrown out was isolationist. And and isolationist ever since World War II always carries the connotation that if you're an isolationist, you're an idiot, and you are probably, there's probably something wrong with your character as well. You're not just misguided, but you're probably sort of evil, or at least so ignorant that you are effectively evil. And the term isolationist is a term like a lot of words that end in ist, that if you sling that term at somebody and you can sort of make it stick, then you don't have to say anything more, because you've discredited the person and thereby discredited the argument. Now, I am by nature a contrarian, so that whenever there is a conventional wisdom, my first reaction is to kind of poke it and see, if it is all it's cracked up to be. So I have always been struck by, the phenomenon that I just sort of described, but I'll explain it from another direction. The United States has gone to war many times in the course of America's independent history. There was a Revolutionary War, there was an undeclared war with France in the 1790s, the War of 1812. You run down the list. And at the time of the war, Americans were in favor of the war, at least to the point where Congress declared war. So there was a majority in Congress. And for the most part, the wars began with general support. Now, not all the wars ended with general support. And with one exception, historians like me came along later and said, well, that war wasn't all you thought it was. And you probably are familiar with the term revisionist history. And it's often used as, again, another kind of term of insult against these people who challenge accepted values. But all it is, it just means you cast a skeptical eye upon conventional wisdom. You revise whatever the conventional wisdom is. And every American war, starting with the Revolutionary War, has received revisionist treatment from historians. So Charles Beard, a progressive historian from the early 20th century, he talked about the American Revolution not being quite what you thought it was. It was at least in large part a matter of property holders objecting to the fact that the British were trying to keep American speculators out of Ohio and so on. Anyway, and you go down the list, and every single war has had its revisionists come along, except World War II. World War II, there is no school of revisionist history on World War II. World War II remains sacrosanct in American memory. Now, there are reasons for this. The reasons start with the fact that it was a war that the United States won, and that always helps. It's easier to feel good about a war that our side wins than one that you lose. It's also a war where, although it began in controversy, and the controversy at the beginning of the war is the one that I focus on in my book. Should the United States get involved or not? But it ended in no controversy at all regarding what I'll call the righteousness of the war. Because as the war developed, and especially as the war ended, and American armies liberated the death camps, then people saw, oh my gosh, Hitler was even worse than we thought. So it's relatively easy to think well of yourself when the person that you're fighting against is absolutely horrible. Because there is a certain kind of comparative morality that goes on. And if that person you're fighting against is absolutely horrible, then, okay, you're pretty good by comparison. Now, if it hadn't ended that way, if it had ended just the way the First World War ended, where the German armies just laid down their weapons, and the Germans, they weren't this singularly horrible set of people, then the fact that the United States had ended the war using an atom bomb, killing 150,000 civilians, that would have really stuck more in American minds. Then it would have been easier for historians to say, was World War II really necessary? But you couldn't say that when the world saw what Hitler, the death camps, the Holocaust, and everything was all about. So there's that part. Now there's another part, and this gets to sort of the psychology of, it's partly the psychology of war, but it's also the psychology of what you put into some kind of undertaking. And that is that when hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives in World War II, it's really difficult for somebody to say, you know, those lives didn't have to be lost. You know, it was political leaders who screwed up. Because, I guess what I should say is maybe it would be possible for a historian to say that, but no public figure would endorse that view, because you'd be telling the mothers, the fathers, the widows, and so on, all the people who lost their lives, that those lives didn't have to be lost. If people give their lives to a cause, you like to think that it was a necessary cause. It wasn't something that was the result of the screw-up of the diplomats. You could see this, I mean, I've seen it, people who studied Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War see it in Lincoln. So when the South seceded, there was some debate whether there should be a war, whether the South should be compelled to come back into the Union. And Lincoln took the position that yes, but it wasn't a universal opinion. And Lincoln himself was, it's not that he was torn with the righteousness of it, but he felt the weight of the decision. Because this is one of those rare cases in history where one person, the decision of one person, it could go this way, it could go that way. And if it goes this way rather than that way, the course of history is dramatically changed. If Lincoln had not said, the South will not be allowed to leave, then the South would have left. There wouldn't have been a civil war, and the history of the United States would have been entirely different. And Lincoln could have decided it that way, but he didn't. But the fact that he did decide it, he decided for war. It was on Lincoln that 600,000 people died. And he, I mean, of course, you know, there was a lot. There were other things involved, but if Lincoln had decided differently, those people would not have lost their lives. And Lincoln became more religious, more obviously religious as the war went on. And he talks more about the mysterious workings of providence. And in fact, in his second inaugural address, he says that, you know, each side went to war thinking it was right. We can't both be right. You know, the war came, and God could have ended the war, but he didn't. You know, and so it was, you know, that this was somehow foreordained. It is as though Lincoln is looking to share, I'll call responsibility rather than blame, but the responsibility for all of the blood that was shed. He can't carry it all himself, so he has to sort of find divine sanction for this. There's something of that in World War II, and the very size of the loss, I think, contributes to this reluctance of people to say, nah, it wasn't what you thought it was. What's the name that has been given to, and I guess adopted by, the generation that fought World War II? The greatest generation. I mean, I think it's rather, you know, bold of any generation to say, we're the greatest generation. You know, what does it make my generation? My father was in the Army during war, but what about us? You know, what are we, chopped liver? And furthermore, the label for World War II is often called the Good War. Now, this should strike you as at least ironic, if not, you know, downright paradoxical, because World War II was the most violent, the most destructive war in human history. How could you call that good? But it was good for the sort of the reasons that I've laid out. But what it means is that, and as I said, it's been impossible for any historian to say, we shouldn't have fought that war. Okay, bear that in mind, because I'm not going to tell you that we shouldn't have fought the war. But I am going to try to explain why there were people, at least ahead of the war, ahead of the American involvement in the war, who thought that the United States should not get involved. Now, partly because I am not teaching this week. I've been a teacher long enough that if I don't teach for a while, I have this itch that has to be scratched. So you're going to help me scratch the itch. You're going to be my classroom. And I'm going to do with you what I do with my students. I'm going to ask you to imagine what it was like to be alive at a particular moment in history. And so I pose thought experiments to my students. I tell my students that the most important thing that history can do is give you the power to see the world through other people's eyes. Because that's what history does when history works best. If you want to know what it was like to be Benjamin Franklin, or John Brown, or Abigail Adams, or whoever it was, then this is the best way of figuring out what history was all about. It's not to hold yourself aloof and say, look at those people who lived long ago, because you have an advantage over them from the very fact that you know how things turned out. And given that advantage, it's nearly impossible not to think, well, we're smarter than they are, because they made those bad decisions. But they made those decisions not knowing how things were going to turn out. So I'm going to pose a question to you. And here's the question. If China should attack Taiwan, should the United States go to war against China? I don't want a show of hands. I just want you to reflect on the question, okay? I want you to reflect on the question because it's a very potentially live question in American politics and diplomacy right now. And it's also a question where you don't know what the answer is. You might have an opinion on what you think the answer ought to be, but you don't know what the rest of Americans are going to do about it. So you don't know what the decision is going to be. It probably will depend in part on who the president is when this event happens. It will depend on some other things as well. But more than that, we don't know how either one of the courses of action will turn out. If the United States does go to war on Taiwan's behalf against China, will it lead to an all-out war against China? Will it lead to the exchange of nuclear weapons? Will it lead to World War III? We don't know. And if the United States does not go to the defense of China, will China become emboldened? Take Taiwan, then they'll go after South Korea, and then Japan. So we don't know. We would be making a decision, assuming we discover tomorrow that there is this attack, we would have to make a decision not knowing what the outcome is going to be. Bear that in mind, because I'm going to take you back to a moment when nobody knew what the outcome of a war that began in Europe in September 1939 was going to be. Nobody knew who was going to be involved entirely, and nobody knew which side would win and what winning would mean. Okay? So this is the debate that I recount in my book, America First. The story really focuses on 2 years and 4 months, from September 1st, 1939 to December 1941. September 1939 is when Europe goes to war, when Germany invades Poland, and Britain and France respond by declaring war on Germany. By the way, that's something that's often forgotten. There's this notion that Germany declared war on Britain and France. It was the other way around. So Britain and France declared war on Germany. Now, they thought they had reason to do so, but this distinction is important for those people like Charles Lindbergh, who is, he's the avatar for me of the anti-war movement. He was actually the most visible spokesperson for the anti-war movement. But he would point this out when it was said that Hitler is rampaging across Europe. Hitler invaded France. Hitler is attacking Britain. And he would point out, not to excuse it, but just to say that the British declared war on Germany France declared war on Germany. So you declare war on a country, that country is going to attack you. Anyway, keep this in mind. Okay, so the United States, as of September 1st, 1939, was almost united, almost to a person, to a man and woman, in saying that we are not going to get involved in this war. This is not our problem. This is not our war. I'll give you a little bit of background on that. Being the historian, I will go way back, but I'll cover the ground quickly. George Washington left office at the beginning of 1797. Before he left, he delivered his farewell address. Actually, it was a written message. A farewell address in which he counseled Americans to take care not to get involved in foreign troubles. Stay out of the wars of Europe. There was a war in Europe going on at that time. He said, stay out of this. And Americans listened to the father of their country. And for the next 150 years, they stayed out of Europe's problems, stayed out of Europe's wars. Europe went to war several times. Americans stayed out, with one exception. And the one exception was during World War I. By the way, here's a bit of a trivia question. When was World War I first called World War I? That's right, when World War II starts. And if you think about it, if you start putting numbers after disasters, you're in trouble. Okay, but anyway, so the United States, under Woodrow Wilson, decided that it needed to get involved in World War I. The British and the French were fighting against Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire. And it was kind of a stalemate. The United States had initially declared neutrality, but the neutrality gradually tilted toward the British and the French, to the point where Woodrow Wilson decided the United States needed to go to war, as he put it, to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson cast American policy, America's fate, America's vision, in terms of these high-minded principles. It wasn't simply that German submarines had been attacking American ships. It was more than that. Democracy was at risk, and the United States needed to defend democracy. Now, defend whose democracy? Just democracy, which was a bit of a stretch because Britain wasn't exactly a democracy. It had this great empire, and the people in India, in the British Empire, they certainly didn't enjoy democracy, and the French had an empire of their own and everything else. But nonetheless, it sounded good, and it inspired Americans, briefly. It inspired Americans for about 18 months, for the 18 months that America was in the war, from the spring of 1917 to the autumn of 1918. Then the war ends. The United States was on the winning side. Whenever the United States is on the winning side in a coalition war, Americans understandably think they won the war. And so they expected that President Wilson would be able to go to Paris, where the post-war peace conference was held, and be able to dictate terms to everybody else. We won the war for you. Well, that's not how the British saw it. That's not how the French saw it. They thought that, well, we won the war, and you guys just sort of came in at the end. And now you're trying to tell us what to do? Forget it. So the peace treaty that comes out of the peace conference was very unsatisfactory to many Americans. It was egregiously punitive toward Germany. And even some of the British negotiators walked out of the Paris Peace Conference saying, it's really foolish to heap so much of the burden of the war on Germany. All you're doing is building in resentment. You are going to make it so that any self-respecting German leader is going to have to say, we got to get rid of this post-war settlement. Furthermore, the British and the French made clear at the end of the war, they didn't fight it for democracy. They weren't going to decolonize their empires. Forget it. They were going to actually add to their empires. So Americans, in fact, almost as soon as the treaty came back to the United States, they are having second thoughts about America's participation. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. The United States had to write separate treaties. The United States did not join the League of Nations, which was one of the outgrowths of all of this. Americans, beginning in the 1920s, the war ends in, the Paris Peace Conference ends in 1919. In the 1920s, Americans are beginning to think, maybe that wasn't such a good idea to get involved in that European war. And then came the Great Depression. And America said, boy, we're never going to go adventuring in other parts of the world because we got big problems at home. By the 1930s, mid-1930s, the conventional wisdom in America was that American participation in World War I was a grave mistake. We ignored what George Washington had said, and it came back to bite us. We will never make that mistake again. And this became formalized, this became institutionalized in law. Congress passed a series of laws called the neutrality laws, mandating that if Europe or any other part of the world went to war, the United States would not get involved. The United States would remain neutral, and explaining explicitly what neutrality would mean. So this is 1935, 6, 7. Meanwhile, Europe is moving more in the direction of war because, as those people who objected to the Treaty of Versailles said, you're going to get a German leader one day who's going to say, we got to get rid of the Treaty of Versailles. This is simply not fair to Germany. This is Adolf Hitler. And he comes to power saying that Germany is a self-respecting nation. We can't be occupied by the forces of the British and the French. Get those folks out of the Rhineland. That a nation has to have an armed forces. It has to have an army to defend itself. He rebuilt the German army. And in doing this, by the way, he helped pull Germany out of the Depression. So Hitler is this leader that the Germans are starting to think, well, okay, we got a guy here. And the British and the French actually, rather than say, okay, well, we're going to smack him down because he's breaking the provisions of the Versailles Treaty, they themselves were feeling guilty about how much of a burden they had placed on Germany, and they realized that was unrealistic. And so you get this dynamic in Europe where the Germans are being more assertive, and the British and the French are saying, well, you know, we probably shouldn't have done it that way, and we don't want to go to war again. So Germany's building its army, Britain and France are not, and so the world looks on this as, boy, there's going to be another war. Because Germany had lost territory at the end of World War I. And if you lose territory, the next generation of leaders comes along, they say, we got to get that territory back. And you can rally your people behind it. So Americans say we don't want to have anything to do with this. And then the war begins in September 1939. And Americans said, see, we were smart not to get involved, and we're going to stay out of it. But then, Franklin Roosevelt decides, you know what? I think we should get involved in this war, except he didn't tell anybody. So, the way I write history is at two levels. I may have even mentioned this on a previous visit here, but I think of history as operating at the level of what I call big history and the level of little history. Big history is the stuff that takes place in public view. This is a declaration of war. It's a spring offensive in a war. It's a presidential election. It's the Industrial Revolution. It's the stuff that makes it into the history books and makes it onto the front page of all the newspapers. That's big history. Then there's the little history. This is the history of individual lives. It's what you did yesterday and what you had for breakfast this morning and what you're going to do tomorrow. It's the individual lives of the people who are the almost numberless folks that make up big history. Now, most of the people the little histories of most people have relatively little effect on big history. For most of us, the big history influences us and not the other way around. But there are a few people, these are leaders of nations, these are, you could call them great figures, but I say great only in the sense of influential. So Adolf Hitler in this sense is a great figure. He had a great influence on the world. a greatly negative influence, but nonetheless. So with these people, you look at the little history, and the little history can influence the big history by motivating them to do particular things. So this is why, when I decided to write this debate about how the United States got into World War II, I focused on two individuals. I cannot help writing history except as almost a subset of biography. So I focus on two individuals in this case. I wrote a book about the coming of the Civil War. And for my individuals, I chose John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. And I like to choose people who take opposite views. So John Brown believed that violence was justified in ending slavery. And Abraham Lincoln said, no, we got to do it peacefully. We got to do it by law. We have to change the Constitution. I wrote a book about Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur and the fight that they got into during the Korean War. And one of the reasons I do this is it allows me to sort of relate a big controversy, a question, a turning point in history, where it could have gone this way, it could have gone that way. But it went one way, and one of the reasons it went the way it did was because of the individuals involved. Also, if I'm lucky, or if I choose my people, my characters correctly, then I can draw readers into the events as they seem to unfold. So when I chose Franklin Roosevelt, well, he's a natural. He's President of the United States. He's also the arch interventionist. He's the one who dissents from that consensus that the United States should not get involved. He dissented from that consensus when Congress wrote those neutrality laws, but he went ahead and signed them because he wasn't ready to tell the world that he was going to lead the United States to lead the world if he had a chance. That come another war, the United States is going to get involved. He knew that Americans didn't want to hear that. So, and he was, you could say he was a canny enough politician. You could say he was, what shall I say, a politician who had a casual relationship with truth enough that he would tell people what he thought they wanted them to hear rather than what was actually the case. So, but anyway, so this is Franklin Roosevelt. He was a member of Woodrow Wilson's administration in World War I. He was an internationalist in the same way that Woodrow Wilson was. But he was a closet internationalist during the 1920s and 1930s when Americans didn't want to hear about that internationalist way of thinking. But he's still a natural one because he's a politician. He's a president of the United States. He's going to be there. The one that is the odd person out, sort of, is Charles Lindbergh. Why is Charles Lindbergh? Why did I choose Charles Lindbergh? Well, it's kind of because Charles Lindbergh chose himself to be the spokesperson of the anti-war movement. Now, Lindbergh, he wasn't famous for his position on foreign policy. People didn't know what his position on foreign policy was before this time. He was famous because he had flown across the Atlantic in this little airplane and electrified America and the world for doing it. Lindbergh became famous in the 1920s in the way that John Glenn and Neil Armstrong became famous in the United States in the 1960s. They did this, they were the astronauts, and they seemed to summarize everything that Americans felt was good about their country. We're at the cutting edge of technology. We do these bold, these brave things, and the world is electrified by what we accomplish. And so Lindbergh became this celebrity. And he was a celebrity at a time when this was almost the beginning of the celebrity age in American culture. His emergence coincided with the development of newsreels. Some of you will know what newsreels were. I don't think any of you are old enough to actually have seen them. But these were television before television. These were short movies that were made with movie equipment, but they showed the stuff that you would see on television. They showed the people, important people. Here's the president giving a speech. Here's Charles Lindbergh returning from Paris, and so this sort of thing. And Lindbergh was made for the newsreels. He was a young guy. He was handsome. He had a nice smile. He was, as modest as Midwestern Americans like to think of themselves and so on. So he wasn't brash, he wasn't bold, he wasn't pushy. And everybody liked Charles Lindbergh. And so he was this sort of the boy wonder until tragedy struck, when his and his wife's infant son was kidnapped and murdered. And so as the nation had been celebrating Charles Lindbergh, now they're mourning with Charles Lindbergh. Meanwhile, the film crews are rolling away, and they got really pushy. They would sort of follow Lindbergh around. They would harass his children. In fact, one film crew broke into the morgue in New Jersey, where the body of the dead child lay, and lifted up the lid so they could get photographs. And well, exactly. And Lindbergh saying, this is terrible. So Lindbergh had this phobia of the media, and I think this is one of those cases where phobia is probably well placed. So anyway, so he becomes the spokesperson for opposition. His father had been opposed to World War I, had been hounded out of politics for this, and he thought that the United States should defend itself, but it should not feel obliged to defend the rest of the world. And he thought that the United States ought to develop this robust perimeter around the edges of the Western Hemisphere, imposing its will, if necessary, on other countries in Central South America, even Canada, and compel them to allow American air bases and the like. In my book, I tell the rest of the story. I won't spoil it by telling you who won the debate. You already know. But I will say this, that in writing the book, I tried to, I asked that question a little bit ago. So what should the United States do in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan? The reason I asked the question is, while this debate was going on, nobody knew how the debate was going to turn out. Nobody knew how the alternatives, how they would turn out. What would happen if the United States did not go into the war? What would happen if the United States went into the war? Now, we know enough that we can't forget how it turned out. And it's very difficult, as I've said at the very beginning, it's very difficult to imagine an outcome where the United States did not go to war, because the way things turned out made it seem necessary that the United States did go to war because of this horrible force that Nazi Germany became. But when Lindbergh and Roosevelt were arguing with it, they didn't know all of this. I mean, in the whole death camp stuff, it followed from Mein Kampf and the Nazi ideology, but it wasn't taking place while the debate was going on. So nobody knew how this was going to turn out. And so you do know how it turned out. And I'm just going to stop there and ask you if you have questions. Because if there's other stuff you want to know, I'll try to tell you. Yes?
Yeah, I was got a question on Germany and Japan. I had read that, I think, the German higher-ups in the German military were advising Hitler not to go to war. If they went to war, the United States would get involved and they would be the arsenal, uninhibited. And
that may have been true, but if so, the Japanese didn't take their own advice.
yeah,
Because it's really clear that Germany did not want the United States to enter the war. Because, understandably, here is the most powerful country in the world all of a sudden come in on the side of your opponents. And a lot of people were warning the Japanese, don't attack the United States. If you do, you know what's going to happen. They're going to come and grind you to powder. But there's a dynamic that takes place. So, of course, the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. Then there was a 72-hour period where nobody knew if that meant a war between Germany and the United States. It obviously meant a war between Japan and the United States, but what about Germany? Germany and Japan had a pact, the Axis Pact, but it was a defensive agreement, so that if either one were attacked, let's say by the United States, then the other one had to join in, although, you know, what is honor among rogues? Hitler double-crossed Stalin and attacked him, so he wouldn't necessarily have honored the agreement. But Hitler decided on his own to go ahead and attack the United States. He figured it was inevitable anyway. He knew Roosevelt well enough, I mean, he could figure out Roosevelt well enough to know that Roosevelt was going to get in this war, so he would rather be on the side of taking the first blow. Yes?
First of all, I just love your perspective on the war and people. Thank you. But I don't like Charles Lindbergh, and I have a question for you that has nothing to do with Lindbergh. But I heard recently that there's a professor who's claiming that Lindbergh was a eugenicist and had his son murdered. And there's a big debate. You know about that. But my question is...
There's not a big debate. There is this person who says that on the basis of no evidence.
Well, he was an asshole,
Right.
but you know that. What I think was brilliant was that at the end of the war, Truman said, let's be friends with the Germans, let's be friends with the Japanese after all that they did. And I think that that was brilliant. What do you think about that?
Well, I would say, I'm not sure I would use the word brilliant. I would say it was canny because the United States is going to need friends against the Soviet Union. Okay? So it wasn't generosity. I mean, there was some generosity involved, yeah. There was also, boy, we really screwed up at the end of World War I by imposing a Carthaginian peace on the Germans. You know, in fact, it's a basic principle of negotiation, whether you're negotiating a business contract or negotiating peace at the end of the war. You have to give the counterparty an incentive to maintain the agreement. If you make the agreement so lopsided that the first thing they're going to do is tear it up and try to get out from under it, then that's no agreement at all. So there's that. I'm definitely going to address the first thing that you mentioned. You don't like Charles Lindbergh. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I dare say that many of you have a negative opinion of Charles Lindbergh. Because the first thing that most people think they know about Charles Lindbergh is that he was a Nazi sympathizer and an anti-Semite. Okay? And I will ask this question. How many of you have read Philip Roth's The Plot Against America? Okay. Well, so this is the best, no, sorry. This is the most strident presentation of that case. So in this novel, and I have to emphasize, it's a novel. He made it up. Charles Lindbergh runs for president and becomes president of the United States, and the United States becomes this fascist ally of Nazi Germany. Okay? So, I'll start with, was Charles Lindbergh a Nazi sympathizer? And I'm going to say not a Nazi sympathizer, but he was an admirer of German culture. Now, some of it was simply the fact that he grew up in the upper Midwest, and he was surrounded by Scandinavians and Germans. And he had great respect for what they had been able to accomplish. And at a time when other parts of Europe and even the United States were kind of floundering through the Great Depression, the Germans were getting their act together after having dug their way out of this big hole that the Versailles Treaty put them in. So there was that part of it. The second thing, so the aspect of was he an anti-Semite? Well, this is one where I get asked, well, what do you mean by anti-Semite? And I say that because we live at a time when people who criticize the policy of the government of Israel today often risk being called anti-Semitic. If you take the position that there ought to be a ceasefire in the war in Gaza because Palestinians are getting killed by the thousands, you risk being called an anti-Semite. Okay? So keep that in mind. Because, and the reason that those people are called anti-Semites is at least in part because it serves the political purposes of the people making the argument. Anti-Semite is like racist, it's like sexist, it's like homophobe, like all these terms where if you can pin the label on somebody, then you don't have to answer their arguments. You can say this is a bad person, and the bad person obviously has bad arguments. Okay? So I will tell you that the Exhibit A in the case for Charles Lindbergh being an anti-Semite was a speech that he gave in Des Moines, Iowa in September 1941. Franklin Roosevelt was on the verge of having carried the United States to war. Roosevelt got the neutrality legislation repealed. He got Congress to support the Lend-Lease Act. He had given 50 destroyers to Britain. He had given the British basing rights in the Americas and all this other stuff. So, and in fact, the United States was already assisting British warships in the Atlantic in trying to chase down German submarines. So Roosevelt was really looking for a pretext of war, and Lindbergh could see that his side had essentially was about to lose the argument. And he had maintained a certain kind of political discretion, tact, that always come to him with difficulty, because he really disliked politicians because they were always saying what they wanted people to hear rather than what they really believed. So Lindbergh gave this speech, and in his diary, and I tell the story in the book, in his diary ahead of time, he's saying, boy, I know this is going to cause a ruckus if I say this, but I got to say it, because it's going to be a disaster if the United States goes into the war, and I have to do whatever I can to prevent that. So he gives this speech in which he says that there are three groups that are most influential in trying to get the United States involved in the European war. Group number one is the British government. And he said it's understandable that the British government would want us to join them in the war, because it would make their chances of winning the war much greater. I don't criticize them for doing this, but I mean, the American people should know that the British have this particular agenda. And Lindbergh didn't know the extent to which the British were operating disinformation activities in the United States to promote Britain's side in the war. The second group, he said, were American Jews. And he said it is perfectly understandable that Jewish people in the United States would want the United States to go to war against Germany, considering all of the oppression, all of the destruction that Hitler and his regime have done to Jews in Europe, who are their cousins and uncles and various other people. So this is perfectly understandable. And number three is, and he said the worst offender here is the Roosevelt administration. The Roosevelt administration, for the narrow political purposes of Franklin Roosevelt, because he wants to be this great hero. He got himself elected a third time on the basis of the war. He wants to hold all this power in his hands. He wants to be president for life. This is what Lindbergh is saying. And so that's the group that's trying to get us involved in the war. Now, he said again that the British have a right to their view. The Jewish Americans, any Americans, have a right to their view. He wasn't so quite willing to grant the Roosevelt administration the rights to his view. But he said, but I don't think that that is in the interest of the United States to follow those views. Now, the very next day, newspapers around the country just blew up because Lindbergh had identified Jews by the name Jews, Jewish Americans. And people said, you shouldn't inject, and the term they used was, you shouldn't inject religion into this debate. We're all Americans here. Now, I will say, he said one other thing about American Jews, and he said they have great influence in the media. Okay? So, I mean, one might say, okay, he's using a stereotype there, although in this case, he was thinking primarily of those newsreels. And at that time, only one of the major Hollywood studios was not owned or run by Jews. And it was, I mean, everybody knew it. So, I mean, that is, yeah, okay. So this is the basis for that claim.
We have one more quick question, and
Okay.
then we're going to get you to the rotunda.
All right, okay.
Oh, thank you. Actually, I have so many questions. It's just in short.
Sorry, just one.
Okay. So after World War II, there are so many wars after, right? Korean War, Vietnamese War, to right now, we have seen so many conflicts, small wars. American people are more divided than ever before. So you mentioned, so World War II considered a good war. Is there any real good war or bad war?
Here I'm going to quote Benjamin Franklin, who at the conclusion of the American Revolution, when he negotiated a peace treaty with the British, and he acknowledged that the peace treaty wasn't perfect, but nothing in life is perfect. But he said, there never was a good war or a bad peace. So peace is always to be preferred to war. However, having said that, that's a little bit flippant, and Franklin himself would not have carried it through because he thought that the American Revolutionary War was a necessary war. So I would say that sometimes there are necessary wars. I wouldn't call the necessary wars good wars necessarily. But, of course, World War II does live in American memory as this war that made Americans feel good about us. Anyway, thank you very much.
Please join us in the rotunda.